Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I don't know why you're here, and I'm not sure what I'm doing. Because I've never been at this kind of event before. You know, sometimes people want a very sober, sanctimonious, quiet end to the day. And other people look for something different. So we'll see how this goes. But I'm going to talk about the Bible, and I'm going to talk about the humour in the Bible. But I want to begin with a story which involves a girl called Greta. Now, I have never met her, but this story is 100% true, because I was told it by her professor, a woman called Irma Fass-Dueck, who is professor of theology in the Mennonite University in Michigan. And it seemed to me a very implausible story, but then I met the girl's mother, Greta's mother, and she said it's absolutely true. The name Mennonite is not familiar to many people, but it's a small tradition, at least within Europe, but a big tradition in North America, and there are quite a lot around Winnipeg, settlers who were sent out of, or rather ran away from Russia, particularly because during the Russian Revolution they were seen as pacifists. They're Baptists, Anabaptists, but have a peace commitment as well as a commitment to adult baptism. And they settled there, and many of them became farmers, and now they have a university there. And they have other universities elsewhere in the States. And one of the things that they believe is very important for the education of their young people is that they should spend time overseas. So some go to the Middle East, some go down to Paraguay, where there are quite a lot of Mennonites in North Paraguay. Some come over to Britain. Greta decided that she'd like to go to Germany because she was brought up in a farm where her grandparents, who spoke German, lived, and her parents lived there as well. She was very musical, that was her primary subject, and she had a particular interest in a period of German music. So she spoke to the professors of music at the Mennonite University and said, for my year abroad, or my semester abroad, or however long it was, I'd like to go to Germany, and I would like to study this particular period in German music. So the musical staff there found a professor in Frankfurt, I think it was, who said that he'd be quite willing to take this student. She could come and sit in on his class. And because she spoke German, there'd be no difficulty with the language. So Greta goes across to America, and she settles into this university. She gets to know the students who are there, and she gets to know the professor, who's very keen that she should not only enjoy academic life, but she should get a feeling for what family life is like. Now, he's married and he has 3 children, so his wife and he invite her to come and spend some evenings with them, to have a meal, to get to know the children, and a rather arthritic old German Shepherd dog who's part of the household. And she's done this 2 or 3 times, and then one day the professor says to her, now Greta, I'm going to ask you something, but you do not have to say yes to this at all if you don't want to do it. It's simply that I'd quite like to take the family away to go into the Alps, maybe for 4 or 5 days. And we'll all get into, we've got a big car, but we don't want to take the dog. It's too old. It would be bad for it to be in the car for that length of time. And we wondered whether, our house and you've met the dog, whether you'd mind dog sitting. So she said, no, I'd be very happy to do that. And so they arranged that for one night she'd come and stay over in the house, and she'd see the walks which the professor did with the dog. She learned how in the morning it was quite a simple walk round a nearby park where there was a grazing area where dogs could go. The evening walk was a longer walk. It usually happened before dinner, maybe about 6 o'clock, and it was going down to a river and then turning right and going through a forest, following a path next to the river, and eventually being about almost a mile and a half away from the house, turning back along a main road which had a grass verge, and the dog would walk on the grass verge, the master would walk on the path, and they'd come back home. So about 3 kilometres in all. Well, the day came when the family were going away. She saw them off, and she looked after the dog. And the first 2 days went fine. The evening walk, the morning walk, and sometimes the middle of the day. And then it came the third day, and it was the evening walk, so at about 5:30, she goes down the path towards the river, she goes along the forest walk, through among the trees, she comes to the furthest place away from the house, about 1.5 kilometres. She makes for her way back with the dog on the grass verge, and she feels the dog pulling on the leash. So she relaxes the leash and she looks down, and the dog goes down in its back legs and then forward in its front legs, and then it dies. Now, she knew how to feed it and how to walk it, but nothing was said about what to do in the event of death of dog. So here's this big old German Shepherd, dying away. And she, being a farm girl, has no difficulty with dead animals, but she thinks it would be respectful for the dog and also for the family if it was given a reasonable burial. So the thing will be to get this dog back into the big garden and to bury it there. So temporarily, she pulls this dead animal across the pavement sidewalk and puts it in front of a house, one of these big fancy houses with lots of shrubs, and she hides it among the shrubs, and she walks back, about a bit over a mile to the house. And she reckons that because the family have a wee girl who's only 2, there's bound to be a pram or a buggy or somewhere. Well, there's nothing to be seen. She looks under the stairs and nothing at all. And then she has a look in the garage and in a garden hut, thinking a big garden, there's bound to be a wheelbarrow. There's nothing like that at all. The only thing she finds is a very large old suitcase. It's about 4 feet long and about 3 feet wide, and it's the old kind that fasten with buckles. You don't zip it up, and it doesn't have wheels on it. These are before the days of the wheels, so it's just wee casters like what you'd get in an old settee. So she trails us away to the spot where the dog died, and the dog's still there. It's dead. It hasn't moved at all. It's under the bushes. So she opens the case and she pulls it out, and she puts this now stiffened animal into the case, manages to get it in, folds down the lid, buckles it at the side, puts it up on its end, and begins to pull it. Now, from what I gather, the roads in that part, or the pavements in that part of Germany, were as bad as the pavements in Glasgow, full of ruts. So it keeps sticking, and it's these wee casters, and she's sticking, she's pulling this, and she thinks, I'll never make it. There's over a mile to go. I'll never make it. And then she realises that she's quite near an underground station, which is on the same line as the underground station, which passes about 30 metres from the professor's house. So she takes it to the underground station, the metro station. She pays for a ticket. She goes through the ticket barrier, and then she's faced with about 35 stairs down to the platform. And she's looking clearly distraught, so distraught that a young German boy, about the same age as her, about 22, comes over to her and says hello to her, and she says hello back, and she says some words in German. He says, you speak German very well, but you're not a German girl. No, she says, no, I come from Canada, and I've only come over here to study. So they have a kind of quick conversation. He says, well, actually, I came over because I saw in your face that you did not want to carry the case down to the platform. She said, no, it's very heavy. He says, look, don't worry. You go down the stairs, and I will bring the case. So she goes gaily down the stairs, gets to the bottom, turns round and waits, and nothing happens. So she runs back up the stairs and discovers that this guy is a thief who has run off with the case. And that's the end of the story. So I'd like you just for a moment to turn to each other and suggest to each other what might have happened next. On you go, do that just for a moment. Now, friends, the last time I did this, I told this story, I asked people what they thought, and there was as many replies as there were people in the room. I think that, for me, the most memorable was this girl who said, well, I think that the boy who stole the case was certainly not a Christian. And so I think that he took it home, and when he opened it, the dog was still alive, and he believed in the resurrection, and he began But I think that what happened, I mean, there's no proof at all, but I think what happened was this boy, 22, might have been a regular at doing this, and he's got a girlfriend the same age, and after he's got the case with a dead dog in it, he doesn't open it, and he phones his girlfriend and says, look, I have just got a case from a Canadian student who entrusted it to me, and I've ran out of the metro station with it. I'm sure there's something in here which will be for you because it's a girl's case. So come round at 7:30. So 7:30, his girlfriend comes, the case has not been opened. He says, now you open it because it's women's stuff that's inside it. Opens the case, big dog, dead dog lying there. They'd think, what kind of people are Canadians that bring a dead dog across the Atlantic Ocean? But when I heard that story, my first thought was, what would Jesus do? Would he pray for the dead animal's soul? Would he provide consolation for the grief-stricken girl? Or would he laugh? Because it's a very funny story. But we don't have any record of Jesus laughing. And there's perhaps a kind of suspicion that laughter is not exactly part of faith. It could be because certainly in the Psalms you have these lines like, all they who see him laugh him to scorn. I said of laughter, it is mad. People laugh at Jesus when he goes to raise Jairus' daughter. So it could be that laughter has these negative connotations, but laughter in the Bible has also positive connotations. Our mouths shall be filled with laughter. The valleys are so full of corn, they laugh and sing. A feast is made for laughter and wine. It's clearly not a Methodist who wrote that. Blessed are you that weep, you shall laugh. So it's not as if the notion is totally exiled, but I think it may be because we tend to think of Jesus as being a very serious person, and we don't really know much about his biography, but we kind of imagine him. You know, he's particularly often spoken about as a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. Well, that's right. That's Isaiah's prophecy, which he fulfills. But this is to do with the crucifixion. This is not to do with the 33 years of life that happened before. So there's every possibility that Jesus was not perhaps as humorless as, well, I'll have to be fair, Theresa May or Jeremy Corbyn. I mean, both these are figures who have been in the news, but both were not renowned for their humour. Now, you look at somebody like Desmond Tutu. Now, there's a person of profound faith and of profound integrity, able to take down with a word some of the government ministers in apartheid South Africa, and yet equally able to say the most outrageously funny things. I was once working in South Africa where he was speaking at a conference, and he tells this story. This was a conference to celebrate the arts. It was called the Arts and Reconciliation. It was 15 years after the fall of apartheid. And Tutu was speaking about the consequence of the fall of apartheid and how people who were people of colour now were able to get the kind of jobs that they never had before. And he said, I remember vividly the first time I left the country as a free man, knowing that I'd get back, and I got on the plane. I was going to America. I got on the plane in Johannesburg, and the plane is going along the runway, and the announcement comes on to welcome us to the plane, the flight going over to Washington, D.C., and just to let us know that the pilots are George Mkladana and Slumkotsotsi. And I said to myself, God save us, they're both black. Now, if a white person had said that, that would be seen as a racist joke. But he could say that. And he knew that because he was able to say that and to make fun with his own language group and his own colour group, there was a reincorporation of humour into the discourse that they could have with the people who once were their enemies. But if we're going to see the humour which is in the Bible, we have to go back almost to the beginning and to a story about a man who's coming up for 100, who's sitting in a garden entertaining angels, as men sometimes do. And his wife, who's called Sarah, is in the kitchen, as women sometimes are, and she's attending to some food. And what separates Sarah from the angels and her husband in the garden is not a brick wall or a stone wall. It's a tent flap because they live in tents. And she overhears this angel saying to her husband, "I'll come back within a year, by which time your wife will have had a baby." Now she's 90. Most women of that age, given that news, would smile. She breaks into laughter. In fact, if you look round your church when you're next there and see a 90-year-old woman laughing, the chances are she's pregnant. That's what it says in the Bible. But then, 9 months later, the smile is on the other side of her face. And she's lifting her maternity benefit and her old age pension from the same post office. And when the child is born, she gives the child a name. She says, "He shall be called Isaac," which is a Jewish word for laughter, because God has made laughter for me. Because God has made laughter for me. And it's one of these magnificent moments in the Bible when you see that the vocation that God has for people who are up in years is not to constantly regret the days that are past, but to be the midwives of the new thing that God is doing. That's why at Christmas, the story does not happen in a kindergarten with children running about in their mother's nightgown and their father's pyjamas. The nativity story happens among people who are all old. Anna and Simeon, Elizabeth, Zechariah, Joseph, the three wise men, and the shepherds are all old people. You would not have wisdom in these days if you were young. You didn't come with a PhD when you're 23. And you wouldn't, if you were a shepherd, leave the job to young boys. They would go away and go to the dancing or chase girls. You had to have someone who was reliable, who would sit all the night if there were wolves about or thieves. And God's vocation in older people is to be the midwives of the new thing that's happening. Now, we're going to sing a song about Sarah in a moment, but I just wanted to indicate that many of the stories about older people are stories that kind of put them down. I heard this story from a Catholic priest about two men, and they're coming up to their 40th birthday. They hadn't seen any of them for each other for ages. One had moved away from the town, and he'd come back when he was coming up for 50. That's right, come up for 50, and said to his pal, "We haven't seen each other. We've both got our birthday on the same day. Why don't we do something together, either on the day or quite near to it?" And the other boy said, "Yeah, we could do that." And the first friend says, "Have you still got your motorbike?" And the guy said, "Yeah, I haven't done it for a while." He says, "Okay, let's go on our motorbikes." And where'll we go? Let's go to the King's Arms at Uttoxeter, because quite a lot of bikers go there, and nearby there's a kind of hill range we could go and scud about afterwards. So they go to the King's Arms in Uttoxeter, and they have a great day together, and they go chasing each other up the hills and pretend that they're teenagers again. And then 10 years passes, and they're coming to 60. And they say to each other, "Shall we do the same again? Shall we celebrate our birthday together? Just one day together. What will we do?" And they think for a moment, and then one of them says, "Listen, why don't we go to the King's Arms in Uttoxeter because they've got a really nice kind of car parking space there, and they have a kind of nouvelle cuisine menu. You know, you don't get much, but it costs a fortune. And then we can maybe play billiards afterwards. Oh, says the second one, that's ideal. So they do it, they have a great day together. 10 years later, they're coming up for 70. And they kind of bump into each other, and they know the date's coming up, and they say, what about it? What about what we do? We're coming up for 70. And the one says, yeah, let's go to the King's Arms. You talk to her. Aha. Yes, let's go, because, well, they've got kind of parking for the disabled, which is quite near the restaurant, and they've got a nice old-fashioned menu, and then afterwards they've got a lovely lounge. We could just sit there and, you know, relax for a while, watch a film. So they have a slower day, but a great day. And then the 80th birthday is coming up, and they say to each other, what we do on our 80th birthday? And they think for a long, long time. And then one says, why don't we go to the King's Arms in Uttoxeter? Because we've never been there. But sometimes it is the older person who wins out. There's this couple who were up in years, and they're talking about what will eventually happen. They're both going to die. That's the kind of certainty about life. But what will happen if one dies before the other? So they, you know, it's an awkward conversation at first, and then, you know, they've been married for 45 years, and then they say, look, can we agree that if one of us is to die and the other is still alive and very active, that we won't hold that whoever's the surviving relative to live alone if they feel they'd like to marry again? Can we agree on that? And John and Mary agree that that's fine, that if one dies and the other's healthy and feels in due course it'd be good to have another partner, that they won't be held to being alone. So as time goes on, Mary falls ill, and she's nursed for a while at home, and then eventually she goes into a hospice and she dies. And she arrives at the door of heaven, and Peter's there, and he says, hello, Mary. Oh, she says, are you Peter? He says, yes, this is heaven, and I'm Peter, and I'm welcoming you into heaven. Oh, she says, that's marvellous. She says, so can I just go in? He says, well, you can, but we're actually doing a wee kind of test at the moment. Oh, she says, I'm not good at tests. He says, no, it's just something that we do. You know, we try to kind of vary the entrance ritual. It's just a wee spelling test. Oh, no, she says, I'm not good at spelling. He says, Mary, can you spell love? She says, L-O-V-E. He says, you're in. So she goes in to heaven. And she sees a whole lot of people that she never expected to be there. And she doesn't see a whole lot of people who are sure they're going to be there. And she gets on very well with Peter. So well does she get on with Peter that he says to her one day, he says, Mary, I wonder if you'd mind just helping me out. There's some things that I have to attend to. So could you just take my place at the door and welcome the new arrivals? You know what to do when you manage that yourself. And it's the same kind of procedure with everybody. We treat everyone the same. She says, okay, fair enough. So she stands there and she welcomes the new arrivals coming in. She asks them the question, they answer it, and they go through. And then she sees coming towards her previous husband. And he says, Mary. She says, yes, John, it's Mary, and I'm here. He says, is this heaven? She says, yes, John, this is heaven. Oh, he says, I'm so glad that I've got here, that I've come here. That's marvellous. So how do I get in? Oh, she says, well, before anything else, I just want to say to you that I'm slightly disappointed. Oh, he says, I know what you're going to say. I know what you're going to say. Now, let me just tell you, you will be aware that 8 months after you died, I married the woman who was your nurse. Yes, that's true. But there was nothing going on when you were alive. Nothing at all. And then after you'd passed away, I just felt lonely. She could see that. We developed a friendship. and we get married. And I, hand in heart, there was nothing happening when you were ill. She said, that's okay. So she says, yeah, this is a wee test. Oh, he says, what kind of test? A spelling test. It's dead simple. Spell xenophobia. Now, let's just sing that wee song which Sarah came up with, God Has Made Laughter for Me. An American woman, about 20 years ago, she set this song to music. So I'll sing a verse and you just sing it back to me. It's very, very simple. God has made, can you hear that? Good. God has made laughter for me. God has made laughter for me. Oh, God has made laughter for me. Is anything impossible for God? Laughter for me. God has made laughter for me. Oh, God has made laughter for me. Is anything impossible for God? Everyone who hears will laugh with me. Everyone who hears will laugh with me. Oh, everyone will laugh with me. Is anything impossible for everyone who hears? Everyone who hears will laugh with me. Everyone who hears will laugh with me. Oh, everyone will laugh with me. Is anything impossible for God has made laughter. God has made laughter for me. God has made laughter for me. Oh, God has made laughter for me. Is anything impossible for God? She's not the only one who inhabits laughter. Years ago, I was invited to preach in Westminster Abbey. You know where that is? It's a kind of big kind of indoor graveyard about 100 yards from the Methodist Central Hall in London. And if you go there, they tell you all the readings for the day. Now, they asked if I'd preach an evensong. Now, this is maybe about 30 years ago. So I got a list of the readings for the whole week, and particularly because they have 5 services, the readings for Sunday. And I'm preaching an evensong and discover that I have to preach from Exodus chapter 2. Oh no, Exodus chapter 2, that's right, round about verse 15. And I thought, well, I must see what's happening in the morning in the Hebrew Scriptures. So the morning was Exodus chapter 1, verses 1 to 9. And that was about the Israelites in Egypt as slaves calling to God for deliverance. That was the morning lesson. And the afternoon lesson, chapter 2, verse 15 or whatever it was God calling Moses to be the deliverer. I thought, now that's quite odd, because half of chapter 1 is missing and half of chapter 2 is missing. Why is the Church of England missing out a big chunk of the Bible? And then I looked at the Bible and discovered why. Because it's begins the story of 2 Hebrew midwives called Shiphrah and Puah. And they are women who are called by the Pharaoh into his presence, because he by this time is worried that the Israelites, or the Hebrews as they were called then, are going to overpopulate the Egyptians. So there's no contraception in these days, compulsory or otherwise, so he decides the best thing to do is to kill the boys when they're born, because these are the ones that cause the trouble. If we kill the boys, we'll limit the size of the population. So he says to these Hebrew midwives, now, ladies, when you are called to a Hebrew woman giving birth, then if the child who is born is male, kill it. And if not, let it live. So boys have to be killed and girls can live. Well, 3 or 4 years later, the old Pharaoh is looking out the window, and there's all these wee Hebrew boys running about who should be dead. So he calls Shiphrah and Puah back in. And he says, what's this? 3 years ago I told you, if you deliver a Hebrew boy. Oh, Shiphrah says, Your Majesty, you don't understand because you're just a man. You see, there's a big difference between Egyptian women and Hebrew women. Huh? See, Egyptian women, when they go into labour, it goes on for about 2 days. Now, the Hebrew women, our type, it's just a huff and a puff, and out comes wee Elijah, and they hide him before we get to the door. And for lying to the Pharaoh, these women are given children of their own. Now, I don't remember the midwife who brought me into the world, but you can imagine these robust women who have to tell mothers when to push and shove and to slap the face of men who are suddenly taken aback that what they've helped to produce has come into the world. That they take on the most powerful man, and by making a fool of him, I mean, he knows nothing about obstetrics and gynecology, nothing about childbirth. So they're running rings around this feckless man, and they're able to bring into birth Moses, who subsequently is kept alive because of 3 other women, his mother, Jochebed, his sister, Miriam, and the Pharaoh's own daughter, who takes this Hebrew child out of the river and brings him up as her own child. And all through the Bible, you find moments when men mostly are duped by women who poke fun at them. I mean, this morning, if people were here, I don't intend to do it all again, but this morning I told the story, which upset, I think, some people at first, of a woman called, what was her name? Oh yes, J.L., who offered hospitality to a passing enemy chieftain who was running away from the battle, and she said to him, "Oh, come in, my lord, come in here, come into my tent, don't worry." And while he's lying down and she's given him some milk to drink to kind of soothe him, he falls asleep, and she finds a tent peg and puts it through his skull, and he dies. That's the story. It's in the Bible. And again, you have women who, in their own way, are duping men. You see, if Sisera, who's the enemy captain, had come past and a man had said to him, "You look wounded, why don't you rest in my house?" he would be very suspicious. But a woman, with all the charm at her disposal, as well as a hammer and tent peg, was able to bring this person in and to deal with them completely. So the humour is there, and very often it's to do with the way in which women interact with men, all through the Hebrew scriptures. And there's many women. I mean, people like Rahab, Abigail, Delilah, the hairdresser, Esther, Michal, all of them dupe men. And if we but read the Bible without the kind of corsets in our mind which say this is all dead serious, please do not ever let us think that there might be something in here which might be vaguely mysterious or amusing. If we take these corsets off our mind and are open to the entertainment of some of the stories, particularly the Hebrew scriptures, we see that. But to be fair to men, let's take a story about a man. Now, this comes from the 2nd book of Kings. I'm going to read it as it says it in the Bible. And it's about Elisha, who took over as being the kind of chief prophet from Elijah. Elisha went up to Bethel, and as he was on his way, some small boys came out of the town and jeered at him, crying, "On you go, Baldy, on you go." He turned round, looked at them, and cursed them in the name of the Lord. And 2 she-bears came out of a wood and mauled 42 of them. Now, some of you are circuit preachers. Some of you are pastors. I wonder if anybody's ever taken this. I don't know whether there's an association of bald men in your vicinity that might quite like this story. It's a very odd story, and it's in the scriptures. It's there for all to see. I mean, it is a bit implausible. I mean, there are 42 boys getting mauled by 2 she-bears. So did they all kind of? I mean, when I was a boy of 12, along with some other boys in the street I lived in, we went from a council estate into a private housing estate where we knew there were apples in the back garden, and you would jump over the wall and pick the apples and then run. If the man came out, you didn't wait there for him to catch you and, assault you, take you to the police or take you home. You just ran. What are these 42 boys? Two she-bears come out. Are they just standing in a row? One saying to the other, what number are you? Oh, you're 39. No, I'm 37. I'll go first. Totally implausible story. So how do we understand it? I'm going to take an analogy. And it's to do with how people who are famous sometimes become the victims of stories about them which are only partially true. When I studied in Glasgow University, the professor of New Testament was a man called William Barclay, a beloved biblical scholar all over Britain and the English-speaking world. And years later, I was working in a town in Michigan, Royal Oak it was called. And I was to do a day with people in the congregation on the Saturday. A member of the congregation had asked me to do this. So I was very happy to do that. And then the minister of that church, it was a Presbyterian church, discovered I was coming, and he got in touch with me and he said, you and I were at college together, would you like to preach on the Sunday? And I said, well, if I can stay somewhere on the Saturday night, I'll preach on the Sunday. So he came on the Saturday for 2 minutes, introduced himself. Now, I didn't know this guy very well. He's not someone who's my best friend or anything like that. I don't think he'd have spat on me if I were on fire at college. He was he kind of kept himself to himself. So the Sunday morning, I get into the vestry, and I'm there half an hour early. He appears at 2 minutes to 11. We've hardly said hello. He walks into the church. I don't know where to sit or when the sermon is. And he welcomes the congregation, and he says, I'm so glad today to welcome my dear friend, my dear friend John Bell, who's going to preach today. And John and I studied together at Glasgow University, and John and I studied under Professor William Barclay. And John will remember how on the first day in the New Testament class, Professor Barclay came in, and he said to us, gentlemen, because it was all men in these days, gentlemen, if I say anything which you do not understand, please raise your voice and I'll deal with your question. And then he turned off both his hearing aids. And I thought, that is absolutely untrue. Totally untrue. I remember the day distinctly because I did not want to get William Barclay. I admired his work, but so many ministers in the west of Scotland tried to be like him. I thought there was a kind of disease going around. You got the Barclay disease, and you'd end up speaking like Willie Barclay, which only he could do. But it was true that he had 2 hearing aids, and they were very prominent. And when he lectured, as he did every Tuesday night for 4 years on Scottish television, BBC Scotland, the whole nation was glued as he would speak about Corinthians or Romans, the letters of Paul. But he never turned his hearing aids off. But you can see how that was slightly based on the truth. And he, because he was what we would call a Ken Speckle figure, was the subject of these stories. There was a story told about him that he had flown into Glasgow airport, and he goes through customs, and the customs man says to him, Professor Barclay, is it you? And Barclay said, yes, it's me. He says, oh, we haven't had you through here for a long, long time. Where have you come from? And Barclay said, well, I've just been actually to Lourdes. Oh, you've been in France? Yes. And what were you doing there? And Barclay says, well, you know how I have a kind of reputation about being a bit cynical about the miracles. Well, I thought if I went to Lourdes, I would be able to investigate a bit, because miracles allegedly happen at Lourdes. So the customs man says, did you have a good... Oh, I had a great visit. Yeah, the French were just delightful, beautiful food, nice company. I learned a great deal. I've come back a much happier person than I was when I went. It's been a great blessing to me. So the customs man said, now, Professor, you might not be aware, but behind you there's a whole lot of people who recognise you, and they're looking at me, and they're wondering if I'm going to ask if you've got anything to declare. So you don't mind me asking? No, he says, I've got nothing to declare. The man said, well, you don't mind if I open your case? No, Barclay says, open the case by all means. So he opens the case, and he says, now, Professor, there's 2 bottles of a kind of brown-looking liquid there. Barclay says, yes, that's Lourdes water. And I have a friend in Strathclyde University who's a biochemist, and I want him to try to see if there's any medicinal properties in the water which might affect the cure. The customs man says, listen, we've got a boy behind the screen here who can do that this very minute. Bartley says, take the bottles. So he goes away and he comes back 4 minutes later. He says, Professor Bartley, I really don't know how you're going to take this. You see, but we've analysed that and it's not Lourdes water. Oh, Bartley says, really? He says, yes, it's finest Courvoisier brandy. And Bartley says, well, that's the biggest miracle I've come across. So the story of that odd incident in the life of Elisha is probably based on the fact that Elisha was an old man, that he was bald, that boys called him Baldy, and that there were bears near Bethel in a wood. All of these things are true. And somebody, not for spiritual reasons, but maybe kind of imagined what would have happened if this bad-tempered, bald-headed man had been called Baldy by a group of boys. Now, it's a great story if you're a Jewish grandmother and you discover that your grandson is calling somebody names and you say, now listen, don't you dare call that person names, because remember what happened to these boys who called Elisha Baldy. And it becomes a kind of folk tale which is used for admonition purposes with younger people. But what about Jesus? Did he laugh? No. We don't know whether Jesus blew his nose. We don't know whether he passed wind. We don't know any of these things. Unless you've got severe constipation, biography doesn't normally deal with bodily functions. But the presumption that Jesus did not laugh is something which runs very deep. And it's proven by a man who came from Australia, from just outside Sydney, who was a fairly conservative believer, and he wanted to stage an exhibition called Jesus Laughed. He knew that the shortest version of the Bible was shortest verse in the Bible was John's Gospel, Jesus wept. And he wondered if it was ever going to be possible that there might be an indication that Jesus laughed. And he wanted to set up an exhibition at the Edinburgh Festival. This is round about 1989. And it was in the Greyfriars Church. And he decided that being in the Southern Hemisphere, he would look, as he was a businessman in different cultures in Asia and elsewhere, for any artist who had ever done or was willing to do a painting of Jesus laughing. And he had a younger friend, Maxwell MacLeod, who lived in Edinburgh, who went occasionally to America and into Europe. And he said to Maxwell, can you just make yourself available to artistic communities and find if anybody would ever paint a picture about Jesus laughing. And the exhibition was due to happen, but there were very, very few pictures of Jesus laughing. And he wondered whether there was a resistance in artists, as if because it does not specifically say a verse in the Bible, then people thought that would be somehow blasphemous or degrading to Jesus. But it wasn't that. And it was my colleague, my former colleague, or my late colleague, who was an artist himself, who said very few paintings are in existence with people laughing. People can think of the Laughing Cavalier. It's so rare that it's well known. And he said the reason is that if you ask a model to grimace, he or she could do that for half an hour. If you ask a model to show anger in their eyes, if you ask a model to look curious, if you ask a model to be smug and self-satisfied, they could do that for ages and ages. But you cannot laugh for a long while. My colleague Graham said, laughter is a fleeting thing. You know, it kind of suddenly comes to a zenith with people with their mouths open and smiling, and then it drops away. And you'll know that sometimes if you've been in a crowd, it could be at a wedding or a party, or somebody's told a story, and it's very funny, and everyone is laughing, and a photograph is taken, and you're the one who's not smiling. And you say, but I was smiling. And somebody says, oh, well, the camera never lies. What has happened is that your laughter has crested before others, or it hasn't crested yet, and your facial muscles are either on the way up or on the way down, but they're not at the peak of laughter. So it was impossible for this man to have an exhibition of paintings from all over the world of Jesus laughing. He did put on an exhibition which was called Jesus Loving and Laughing, and it was a very successful exhibition with beautiful paintings. In many of them, Jesus has a smile on his face, but there's none when he's having a kind of belly laugh. But we have to think outside that a little bit, and to realise something about humour, and about how humour, whether it's in the Bible or whether it's in conversation, doesn't always carry from one culture to another. And you'll know this if you've done it. I have done this. If you've tried to tell a joke to someone whose first language is not English. You see it in Glasgow. People talking to a Japanese person in the Museum of Modern Art, and they're telling this Japanese couple a funny story, and they're not laughing at all. So they tell the story again a bit louder, and they still don't laugh. And then they tell them again louder yet, and then the Japanese couple go, ha 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 ha, because they don't want to hear it again. They can't understand it. Very few stories which are funny are transferable across cultures. It just doesn't work, because every language has its own idiosyncrasies, its own double meanings. I think the only person who can do this successfully is Tutu. I heard him tell this story in Birmingham, which I knew he also told in Colombia. And it's a fairly kind of dark story. He said there were three men during the apartheid era, two men rather, during the apartheid era, who were on death row in the central prison in Johannesburg. And they were told when they went on death row that their execution would not be far off. And that on the day before the executioner would come with the person who was in charge of the prison and brief them as to what was going to happen. That they would be given the possibility on the evening before of making a last telephone call, and they could have a meal of their choice, and then the next morning the warders would take them into an anteroom, and in the anteroom the warder would say, you're both going to be executed, and when you go through one at a time, you will be given a choice either to be electrocuted on the chair or to be hung. And he'll toss a coin, one will shout heads, one will shout tails, and whoever's the winner will be the first through the door. So the day comes when the prison governor and the executioner arrive and have these men together and say, I'm really sorry to tell you that tomorrow will be the day of your execution. And what's going to happen is that you can make a last phone call today, you can order the meal of your choice, tomorrow morning, 6 o'clock, we'll come and take you. You go into the room next door, a coin is tossed, you shout head or tails, you go into the chamber and you choose the way in which you want to be exterminated. So the morning comes and all that ritual happens, and they toss a coin, one says head, one says tails, heads wins, so the man goes through into the execution chamber and he's faced with a gallows, with a rope and a chair. And he says to the executioner, I think I'd rather be electrocuted. So the man puts him in the chair, he fastens him in, he stands back, he throws a switch and nothing happens. So he takes the plug out the wall and he examines it and it seems perfectly fine. He puts it back on the wall, he stands back, he throws a switch, nothing happens. So he checks all the wiring round about the chair and everything seems to be in absolute working order. He changes the plug, he puts a new plug in, he puts it in the wall, throws a switch and nothing happens. So he says to the prisoner, well, clearly you're never meant to die, so I'm just going to release you. So he releases him, and the prisoner walks out of the execution chamber into the anteroom where his friend's sitting, and he says to his friend, whatever you do, don't ask for the chair, the damn thing's not working. Now, Tutu could tell that in South Africa, could tell it here, he told it in Colombia, where he was asked to try and do some reconciliation work between the guerrillas there who had waged a war, the people who were drug dealers, and the government. But it's not really universal. And we know this particularly in Scotland. Where I come from, we use a whole lot of sarcasm. I mean, if you say to somebody, how are you doing today? They're likely to say, oh, I'm just hanging on. I mean, they don't feel like they're having a great time, but they just say that. They say exactly the opposite from what they mean. And it's not good for us, because we kind of anticipate that'll work with everybody. There was a man called Darcy Wood, who is a Uniting Church, he may not be with us any longer, a Uniting Church minister from Australia. And I'd met him in Australia when I was working there. And so Uniting Church is Methodist Congregationalists all put together. And about maybe 6 years ago, I meet Darcy in a conference in London. And he says to me, you don't remember me? Oh, I says, I do remember you. I says, in fact, the last time that we met, you borrowed £10 from me. He says, I did not. I said, you did so, and your name's Darcy Woods. He says, that's right, I'm Darcy Wood. So we had a conversation, and that was fine. 2 months later, I get this letter from Australia, from Darcy Wood, saying, it has troubled me to think that I borrowed £10 from you and never... So he put a £20 note into this. No, you just shouldn't do that. You shouldn't do that. It doesn't work. It doesn't work. And it doesn't even need to be words. Humour can be communicated in other ways and misunderstood by those at whom it's directed. There's a man in Glasgow called Alan Poot. Alan Poot. And he is of South African extraction. His father worked for Shell, the Dutch oil company. And his father was their kind of Southern Hemisphere main representative. So he was engaged in going round countries in Asia in order to do business on behalf of Shell, which is based in the Netherlands. And he and a travelling companion were on a long train journey in China. And they were in a compartment where, this is in the days of when Mao was in charge, so all the people there are dressed in the same kind of dark overalls, peasant overalls. And here are these two businessmen who are white and who are people who look quite sophisticated. And Alan Poot's father decides that he'll do something which he used to do to fascinate his children, because he knew that these Chinese they could not understand a word, but they're looking at every move that these two white men make. So he takes out an apple, which he's brought with him for the journey, and a very small penknife. And he begins to take the skin off the apple, just a couple of centimetres at a time. And it's about, a foot and a half, 2 feet long as it's gone down to the ground. And all these Chinese are looking at this in abject wonder how this man's doing it. And eventually he finishes it and he holds it up, and it's about 3 feet long. And he grabs it all in his hand and he throws it out the window. Now his friend bursts out laughing. These Chinese people don't know whether they've seen a miracle or a ghost. They don't understand this at all. He was having fun at their expense, and they just did not realise it. And that's why, in different cultures, humour doesn't always carry. And we have, to some extent, to be hospitable to people from different cultures and not expect our humour to transform. Now, in a moment, I'm going to look at humour in the New Testament, but it's time we sang another song, so I'm going to ask if we can bring up From Adam Came the Apple. And this, you know the tune here, but I'll sing the first half of each verse, and you sing the chorus. So can you see this? Okay. From Adam came the apple, from Abraham the seed, from Noah came the floating zoo, from Cain the jealous deed. And God tied up the parcel which we call human life, a bundle of adventure and love and pain and strife. In Eve was harmless pleasure until she was beguiled. In Sarah there was envy until she bore a child. And God tied up the parcel which we call human life, a bundle of adventure and love and pain and strife. Take Samson and Delilah, take David and his wives, take Jesus through his ancestry, all show imperfect lives. And God tied up the parcel which we call human life, a bundle of adventure and love and pain. In Christian and in Muslim, in Buddhist and Hindu, there lie the common fault lines found also in the Jew. Yet Jesus, born in Palestine, loves those of every race, for he detects God's image in every human face. It is not endless conflict, but God who is our goal, who planned our many differences and yearns that we be whole. O Spirit of our Maker, do more parts unfound, enable us to recognize the paths to common ground. So the way we say things doesn't transmit always. And also, the whole thing about British humour, it's often tied up with language. That the way we say things doesn't carry. Let me take an example. This is a kind of seaside postcard, a letter to a teacher. Please excuse Albert for being off school on Monday. He had diarrhea through a whole new sock. Now, we can understand that, but nobody else, taking it literally, would understand it. We just got a very kind of odd phraseology, but we also have what might be called culturally bound puns. A lot of the English language has to do with puns and them being used. Now let me take an example. There's a church hall which I entered in Lincoln one dark November night. I had a train journey from London. It was a cold train, bitterly cold. I go into this church hall. There are 4 men standing. I go up to them and I said, "Is there a loo in this place?" And one of them replies, "No, but there are 3 Georges." Now, if I tell that story in America, people think there's something wrong with them. We don't get that. But by the same token, if I were to tell, perhaps in that Lincoln Church Hall, of how there were 2 Marines, 2 American Marines who were on leave, and they're standing on a pierhead with one foot up on the railings looking out to sea. And the one Marine says to the other, "Oh, I wish you were abroad." And the other says, "No, I like you the way you are." Then that doesn't always translate, because the words mean different things in different contexts. It just doesn't work all the time. And there's also a kind of in-group humour. Pastors, ministers tell stories about ministers that other people might understand. Golfers tell stories about golfers that other people might not understand. Here is a story which, unless you're a tuba player, you will not understand. About this boy who is 15 and his mum says to him, "I've always wanted you to play an instrument." And the boy says, "And I've always wanted to play an instrument." And his mother says, "And what if you wanted to play?" He says, "You already know, I've always wanted to play the tuba." And his mother says, "Well, okay." The boy says, "There's a man who teaches it in our town." And his mother says, "Okay, well, I'll drive you there, I'll phone him up and you can have a tuba lesson." So he goes with his tuba and he goes in for half an hour and he comes back home. His mother says, "So?" The boy says, "It was great. I've learned to play 1 note. Fantastic," she says. He says, "I'm going to practice it all week." He does. The second week, he goes on his bike into the teacher. And after half an hour, he comes back home. His mum says to him, "Well," he says, "I've learned 2 notes. It's great." His mother says, "That's fantastic." He says, "I'll play them all week, don't you worry." He does. Third week he goes in for his half-hour lesson. He comes back out. And his mother says, "Well?" He says, "Well, I'm not going back." Oh, his mother says, "Why?" He says, "Well, now I can play 3 notes and I've got a gig." Now, unless you're a double bass player or a tuba player, you don't get that. But for many people who are double bass players or bass guitar players or tuba players, you're playing pum, 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 pum. You're playing three notes. And when you have to explain it, when you have to explain a joke, it just loses its calibre. The moderator, or the ex-moderator of the church I belong to, he's called Andrew McClellan, years and years ago. He's like the president of the Methodist Conference. He's only in for a year. But years ago, in his year, the timetable was set up before he was appointed, certain things he had to do. And one of them was to go to a centenary celebration of a prestigious Masonic lodge in Edinburgh. Now, Andrew was not a Mason, and he had no idea what to expect. But he had a friend who was a Freemason, and he said to him, look, I'm in a dilemma. I have to go to this prestigious dinner. I've never been in a Masonic lodge. I don't know anything about Freemasonry. What will I say? His friend said, you'll do three things. The first is you'll bring the good wishes of the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland. The second is you will thank the lodge for the work that its people, the members of the lodge, do for charity. And the third thing is you'll tell them this story. And he told Andrew a story. Now, Andrew trusted this man implicitly. He wasn't a person who would in any way embarrass him. So the night comes, and Andrew is a guest of honour, and he's a very good public speaker, and he speaks very well, and he does these basic things. He brings the good wishes of the Church of Scotland, says a bit about that. He's learned a little bit about the charitable work of the Masons. He thanks them for that. He tells them the story. They collapse in laughter, and the only person who is not laughing is the person who told the joke. Because it was a joke which only Freemasons would understand. Now, these things we have to keep in mind when we're looking for humour in the Bible. Because some of the humour comes from the way in which things are said. And one of the lacks, it's not a serious lack, it just happened. One of the lacks in the Gospels, in fact all through the Bible, but particularly the Gospels, is there are few adjectives and few adverbs. So it's mostly prepositions, verbs, and nouns. So here's the story, or just part of the story, that comes from the second chapter of John, when Jesus is at the wedding feast at Cana of Galilee. And the mother of Jesus was there, and Jesus and his disciples were also among the guests. The wine gave out, so Jesus' mother said to him, they have no wine left. And he answered, that's no concern of mine, my hour has not yet come. And his mother said to the servants, do whatever he tells you. Now, how did Mary say this? Did she say, Jesus, I think the wine has run out? Did he say, Mother, my time has... I mean, is that the way they talk to each other? How did they talk to each other? I asked that to a group of people in Preston at a retreat looking at the miracles of Jesus. And this woman, to my astonishment, said, I think she was very angry. I said, really? She said, yes. I said, why? She says, well, Mary is the guest of honour. She's mentioned first. And she is not there in order to be the caterer. She's enjoying the food and she's enjoying the wine. And suddenly it runs out. And you know why it ran out, Mr. Bell? I said, no, you tell me. I'll tell you. It ran out because he had arrived with his 12 disciples who probably hadn't eaten or drank for 2 weeks. And that's where the food went. Now, who is to say that that is wrong? This woman looked to me like a kind of mother who had fed probably a few football teams in her day when her son brought back other guys. And who's not to say that she recognised in what Mary said an element of humour which totally goes over the heads of people who read this with a very straight face. In John's Gospel, you have to watch for this. This is a passage, it must be 4 years ago, maybe 5. I twice spoke at 2 conferences of Methodist superintendents, and I read this passage from Scripture, which is about how there's a sheep gate at Jerusalem, and there's a pool whose name is Bethesda, and it has 5 arches, and in them lay a great number of sick people, blind, lame, and paralysed. And among them was a man who had been crippled for 38 years. And Jesus saw him lying there, and knowing that he'd been ill a long time, he asked him, "Do you want to get better?" "Sir," he replied, "I've no one to put me in the pool when the water's disturbed. While I'm getting there, someone else steps into the pool before me." And Jesus answered, "Stand up, take your bed and walk." And the man recovered instantly. He took up his bed, began to walk. And I said to these people, what happens next? And I think one on each occasion out of about 200 superintendents knew what happened next. Because for most people, the story stops then. And there's songs about it, about how the man is able to walk and deliverance has happened to him. And it stops there for no apparent reason. It just stops. But it's only 1/3 of the story. So here's the second part of the story. The first part is in the Pool of Bethesda. The second is a street somewhere in Jerusalem. Now that day was the Sabbath. So the Pharisees said to the man who had been cured, "It is the Sabbath. It is against the law for you to carry your bed." And the man answered, "The man who cured me, he told me, 'Take up your bed and walk.' And they asked him, 'Who is the man who told you to take up your bed and walk?' But the man who had been cured did not know who it was, for the place was crowded and Jesus had slipped away. Now, if this happened in Glasgow, if a man who had not walked for that number of years suddenly could walk, he would go through the streets with a bed in his head, going, 'Here we go, here we go, here we go, here we go.' Along come the Pharisees, 'Hey, you, with a bed in your head. It's against the law for you to carry a bed on your head on the Sabbath.' Man says, it wasn't me. The man who cured me, he told me, 'Carry your bed on your head.' 'What is the name of the man who told you to carry your bed on your head?' 'Oh, I don't know, he didn't leave a calling card.' And that's it. And it's as if John sets up this very comic situation, as he does elsewhere with the man born blind, to make fun of these Pharisees who cannot delight in someone who's regained their capacity, but rather sees it as something which is a breaking of the law. Now let's take another instance. The woman at the well. I don't need to read the story because you know the story. And I've heard this preached from people in the west of Scotland where I live, who will begin, I make it almost verbatim from childhood, the woman at the well. Now, friends, if ever there was a sad woman, it was the woman at the well. A woman who had shamed herself. A woman who probably had never been able to conceive. That's why she had this crowd of men, none of whom had become a father. A woman who probably dressed in the darkest of clothes so that she wouldn't make a scene when she went outside. A woman who never would actually go out of doors unless probably it was dark. Such a sad, sad creature. There's nothing in John's Gospel that says that at all. There's nothing about her age. There's nothing about whether she's fertile or infertile. Nothing. But that was the dominant image which was given to us about this very sad woman. Now imagine she's a woman who quite likes men and makeup, and she changes the colour of hair according to the liturgical season. And she's in her kitchen one day, and she looks out the window and says to herself, "Oh, who's that at my well? He's not a local boy. I know all the local boys. He looks slightly Jewish. What's a Jewish boy doing at my well? Maybe 30, 31? You know, it's so hot, and I'm very thirsty. Maybe if I just take this bucket and go to the well." And out she goes to the well. And he says to her, "Can you give me a drink?" And she thinks, oh, shall we have coffee? And he says, you know, if you asked me, I could give you water that lasts forever. And she thinks, oh. And then he says, go and call your husband. And she thinks, oh, why is he wanting me to go and call my... Maybe he's trying to find out if I'm available. So she says, well, actually, I don't have a husband. And he says, you're dead right, you've had 5, and that man up the stairs is not one of them. And her cover is blown. Now, whether you read this in Greek or whether you read it in English, that is a transformative moment. Jesus has blown this woman's cover. And if she thought that she could give him the come on, and I'm not saying that that's the only possibility, it ends there. But what suggests to me that this was a feisty woman and not some kind of dwarfed creature who lurked about in the shadows is the end of the story. Because this woman goes and compels a whole village to come to Jesus. Somebody who's shy and retiring and guilt-ridden, all the rest of it, might not be able to do that. To go and say to people, I don't care what you're doing, I have met a man who's told me all about me, and he knows all about you, and you come, bring your husband, bring your kid, bring your dog if you like, but come and hear him. And she brings a whole village, and Jesus loves the company so much of Samaritans that he stays for an extra 2 days. And our enjoyment of that story and our enjoyment of that woman depends on how we depict her. And all the Greek teaching of the language and all the theological reflection doesn't do it all. Sometimes we have to use God's gift of our imagination to figure out just what an encounter like that could be like. But there's other moments. I'll mention 2 more and then we're finished. Other moments where it's a little more evident. In Matthew 17, verse 24, we read, when Jesus and Peter reached Capernaum, the collectors of the temple tax came to Peter and said, does your teacher pay the temple tax? Oh, yes, he does, said Peter. Oh, when they came home, Jesus spoke about it first, and he said, now, Simon, from whom do the kings of the earth collect taxes? From their own people or from others? Oh, from others, Peter said. Then their own people are free of charge, said Jesus. But so as we don't offend them, go and cast a line in the lake, take the first fish you catch, open its mouth, and you'll find a silver coin. Take that and give it to them for you and me. Now, is this a miracle? Take the first fish you catch, open its mouth, you'll find a silver coin, take that, give it to them for you and me. Is it a miracle? All the miracles in the gospel involve people who are in need. And Jesus never uses his miraculous powers for his own benefit. But as well as that, in every miracle in the Bible, Jesus does or says something, and then the result is given. What it doesn't say here is that Peter went and caught a fish with a silver coin in its mouth, and that paid the taxes. So it might just be that Jesus, who has the same language skills as anyone else, knows that this Peter has to be cajoled. And he says to him, Peter, okay, we don't have any money. What's my trade? And Peter says, carpenter. That's right, we've got no wood here. What's your trade? Fisherman. Okay. So you see that lake there? If you just go and use your trade, you'll catch a fish with a silver coin in its mouth. And Peter says, I've heard of gold fillings, Jesus, but a silver coin is going over the top. And Jesus says, listen, you see next to the temple, there's a market. If you catch a 5-pound salmon, how much will you get? And Peter says, oh, I never thought. And Jesus says, no, you never do. And here he is cajoling the disciple, not to expect him to produce the wherewithal, but to use his own skill. Now, there's also what we might call culturally bound humour, and one of the instances of what is a story which Jesus tells, which is culturally bound, is the story of how a man is in bed at night along with his wife and children, and a knock comes to the door, and he doesn't want to answer it, but eventually he does, and the voice outside says, look, I've got friends who've just arrived, I don't have any food for them, can you give me a hand? And the man reluctantly decides to help. I never fully understood this story until I was working with Christian Aid in El Salvador. And I went to the poorest house which I've ever been in. And I've been in poor houses in Paraguay and in South Africa and in Britain. This was a house in which there was a boy who was 14 years of age called Youth living. And he lived with his mother, who was an inebriate. She was an alcoholic. And very often she wouldn't come home. They shared one bed. The house was really a tin shack. And there were holes in the roof. It was an earthen floor. There was no linoleum, no wood, no carpet. And the holes in the roof required that when Youth hung up the few garments he had, his shirt, his trousers, whatever, he put them on pieces of string which went from one wall to the other, trying to avoid the water should it rain and water come in from the roof. And the night before, I went with a photographer to interview this boy. In that house, there had been 2 ducks, 2 hens, one of whom had laid an egg under the bed, a dog and a cat. That scenario is not far different from the black houses in the island of Skye or from the Palestinian houses of poor people at the time of Jesus. When you had just one room, and when, because the temperature by and large was fairly clement, a lot of life would be spent outside. But if you're a poor family, you'd have this house with one room, and there'd be one bed for the family. And if the weather was inclement, if the weather was bad, you'd bring in the animals that you had. You'd bring in perhaps the goat, bring in the hens, keep them out the road. Or if there were raiders about, just bring them in. And they would lie down, and the family and the animals would sleep. So we can imagine the scenario where there's this bed which is maybe about a foot off the ground. And there's the father against the wall to keep the draught from the children. And maybe there's 3 children in between head to toe. And then there's a mother at the side of the bed so that she's able to swing her legs over and put the baby to the breast if she has to feed the baby during the night. And it's late on and there's a knock at the door. And the guy doesn't want to hear it. But it's persistent, and his wife eventually persuades him, you have to answer this door. So he gets up. And in pitch darkness, because there are no electric lights, he has to walk over his sleeping children and get to the edge of the bed and then put his foot down, not knowing whether what he touches will be animal, vegetable or mineral, soft or hard. And people who hear this story begin to snigger because they know that kind of situation. They know that this place, if he tramps on a cat or he tramps on a lamb, this place could turn into a menagerie in no time at all. People know that and begin to laugh, and Jesus says, yes, and if you knock on God's door, God will go to all that trouble to give you what you need. So he uses a domestic situation which is full of the possibility of catastrophe to say something which wins the attention of the public and allows him to make the transition from there to God. Now, why is the humour recorded? It's recorded because Jesus was fully human. We suspect people who don't laugh or smile. Is it an illness or a fault in them? We feel happier if we know that people can laugh and can smile. It explains to some extent why Jesus was crucified. Because he didn't behave like one of the establishment, and sometimes he poked fun at the establishment. And people who are part of the establishment can't stand people poking fun at them. I just read 2 weeks ago the book written by Mary Trump, who's the niece of Donald Trump, it's a psychological profile of her uncle. She is a qualified psychologist. She's got a doctorate in psychology. And she speaks of how one of the things that Trump hates is people poking fun at him. It seems that when he was 12 or something, at a family gathering where all the aunts and uncles were present, somebody poured a bowl of, I don't know what it was, custard or something over his head. And when people bring that up at the present day, if his Aunt Mary says, oh, remember that he just can't stand anybody kind of poking fun at him. People in authority are a bit like that. And Jesus pokes fun at those who are in authority. And the humour is also there to let us know that God's ultimate will for humanity is not gloom or despair. God's ultimate will is that we should delight in God's company and gather at God's table at the end of time, where there will be the finest of food and the best of company. What God intends for those who love him is not eternal misery, but eternal joy. Because the gospel is not God so hated the world that he predestined it to damnation. The gospel is God so loved the world that he sent his Son. The gospel is not your sins have caught you out and you're banished to the darkest corners of hell. The gospel is your sins are forgiven, go in peace and sin no more. The gospel is not I have come that my cynicism might infect you and your despair might be endless. The gospel is I have come that my joy might be in you and that your joy might be complete. So we're going to finish with another song to a tune that you'll know, and it'll come up on the screen, and it begins, aged 90 and 100 years our ancestors were told. Are the words there? Right. Nice English tune. Ta-da-dum pum pa-dum pum pum pa-da-da-dum da-da-da-da. Aged 90 and 100 years our ancestors were told to bring a child into the world, they'd spite their being old. So Sarah giggled, Abram laughed, and when they had birthed a boy, they called him laughter as a sign that God's intent was joy. Much later Miriam beat the drum when safely on dry land, and David danced before the Lord that all might understand. Our fears dispelled and hopes restored, our gifts without alloy, all meant to celebrate the truth that God's intent is joy. So Jesus at the wedding feast, when all had drunk their wine, replenished empty glasses as a kindly gift and sign, that happiness and deep delight are meant in hymns employ, to show a dour and doubting word that God's intent is joy. Not shallow precious sentiment or forced frivolity, not novelties to entertain or fabricated glee, but deep as lakes and bright as light which nothing can destroy, and meant for every human heart is God's intended joy. That's it. Thanks for being here.